Hello and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Series. I'm Oriel Morrison. It's estimated that the world's cities account for less than 2% of the Earth's surface, yet they consume nearly 80% of the world's energy and produce more than 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. There is no question that cities are where the most crucial change is needed when it comes to fighting climate change. Just over half of the world's total population already live in cities, and that's set to increase to near 70% by 2050. Jason Byrne from the University of Tasmania warns that time is running out.
I think it's frightening when we look around the world and we look around the Asia Pacific to see just how short the time frames are that we have to act. In many ways, we're being complacent as a global society, but in the Asia Pacific more particularly, thinking that we have generations, decades to act. The latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us that that window for action is indeed very narrow, and we may have less than a decade in which to scale up the sort of responses that we need to be taking before we break through what we might be considering as planetary boundaries for sustaining our life support systems on the planet, but also being visited by some of these kind of global consequences like heat waves and flooding that we're seeing more recently. So some of the cities around the Asia Pacific that are acutely vulnerable are cities like Shanghai, for example, where we may see large parts of Shanghai go underwater by the middle of the century. Uh, and this is frightening when we think about that kind of pace and scale of change. Other cities like Jakarta, for example, in Indonesia, acutely vulnerable to flooding and to sea level rise. And then we have cities in Australia and New Zealand that are just as vulnerable as well with things like heat waves and bushfires.
The Arcadis Sustainable Cities Index ranks 100 of the world's cities, examining them across three pillars of sustainability: planet, people and profit. The 2022 results show that only one Asian city is in the top 5, Tokyo. David Raftery, Country and Business Area Director of Resilience at Arcadis, says that Asia is aware of the problem.
I think over the past decade or two, they've put a huge investment in people. So there's no doubt that there's cities in Asia who could be prone to greater impacts around sea level rise and climate change. But their focus has been around the people aspects of it and indeed a reinvestment of profit. So healthcare, education, access for all citizens and activation of the public spaces. And the public spaces are shared really well across all of the citizens of the urban centres. And of course, not terribly surprising, a huge investment in a really well interconnected public transport network. They've always had a good infrastructure around the humble bicycle, which oftentimes is overlooked but is quite important. And of course, also important for the pedestrians as well. So for some of those cities, they're trying to move away from the car. The original design of the cities could have been to make sure that the cars moved around quickly, but they are looking at buses and trams and trains, perhaps a little more assertively than some of the other cities are.
Well, so Tokyo was in the top 4, the top 5 rather, as I said. Was there any other Asian city in the Asia Pacific region as a whole that really stood out to you?
Singapore and Seoul. I think that they're two cities that have been on a huge journey in terms of the evolution of an urban centre. I think a big investment in infrastructure, public spaces, a big investment in transport, but it is around equality. And one of the things that I think jumps out for me is the equality. So each citizen within these cities feels like that they've got equal access to all of those things. Singapore and Seoul have done some great work over the past decade or two, and I would commend those two cities in particular.
Our linear approach to economic growth is a significant problem on a planet with limited resources. Hence the rise of circular cities, those with a focus on the 3 Rs: reduce, reuse and recycle.
Nowadays, we're beginning to realise that we have to think in a joined up fashion. So a good example might be what we would call urban metabolism, where we consider waste which in the past was something we didn't think about too much, and reimagine how it might be a bonus for us. Waste to energy is one of those that's talked about a fair bit. But can we imagine, for example, waste to district level heating, where we take sewage, run it through digesters, harvest the methane, and then use that for heating, for cooking, and even for cooling, for energy generation for cooling. So it's about flipping our paradigm that we've had in the past on its head and thinking about how we might turn a problem into a solution.
And really using the circular economy concept.
Yeah, Kalundborg in Denmark is a great example of the circular economy concept, where a whole bunch of industries that used to pollute have been joined together in a kind of metabolism relationship, where the waste output from one industry becomes the raw material input for another industry. So they've taken a power station and connected it to a gyprock plant that makes plasterboard. Some of the waste from the power station are used for cosmetics. The waste heat for the power station is then used for growing food locally, because food is one of those key challenges that we face at the moment. So we can begin to get some metabolic processes in place within cities, treating them like they're organisms.
In fact, European cities are the leaders when it comes to sustainability overall, holding 7 out of the top 10 spots in the Arcadis Index.
It's all about people, profit, and places. And so when they have profit available, they're reinvesting it. In terms of people, what they're doing is they're really focusing on the concept of equality. And for planet and place, they're really considering climate change as a here and now issue. And they're also restoring and reactivating spaces in an urban setting.
Now, Oslo took the very top spot. It's number 1. You're pretty excited about this city. Tell us why.
Again, it's about the balance. They've got a track record of really being aware of climate change, and I think also around equality. And that's equality from a people perspective of access to healthcare, education, from a people perspective, access to technology and Wi-Fi. And the profit is around the reinvestment. So we give them big kudos on a number 1 because they've achieved the split across the 3. And perhaps, Oriel, they're regarding prosperity in a slightly different way to other cities. And they're linking sustainability with prosperity, which for us in Arcadis is absolutely critical, and a big thumbs up.
While the world's cities are responsible for 75% of global CO2 emissions, they can also play a major role in addressing climate change. And our urban centres are being recognised as engines for economic growth and innovation.
There are some very creative solutions to tackling climate change and climate change impacts, both in terms of adapting to the changes that are already beginning to manifest, but also in mitigating, in cutting our emissions, because cities account for up to 70% of global emissions. So cities are both the problem and a potential solution to climate change, paradoxically. So we can look at some good examples like Seoul in Korea, for example. They're tackling a big problem with car dependence, which is a high source of emissions, carbon emissions, through private automobile use. They're tackling that by tearing out freeways. And you might go, hang on a second, tearing down freeways? Seriously? But in Seoul, in the Cheonggae-Cheong Expressway, was removed and turned into a large greenway that now runs through the heart of the city. It has brought back numerous species that weren't seen in Seoul in many decades. The temperature in Seoul has declined dramatically, and more people are now taking public transportation. So that's one example of a very innovative, albeit quite dramatic intervention to adjust to climate change.
I think what I'm really enthused about for some of the cities is the reactivation of spaces that were perhaps redundant, not used, derelict, and how creative we've been post-COVID in reactivating some of those spaces. Arcadis is working with some projects in Paris where very simply, Oriel, sometimes as engineers and scientists, we always want to get something really complex and technologically advanced. We are just looking to plant out a couple of 100 hectares within the Paris environs with trees and make it a really accessible space, which from a climate change perspective is good. It also helps to try to control temperature in those areas. A very basic one. I think for the other ones, post-COVID, we need to really take a look at the inequality that the car has in our cities. And for a lot of cities, they've taken a look and said, well, the evolution of transport is going to be not an individual car that needs a parking space for the day. It's going to be rideshare. The rideshare vehicles are going to be autonomous and much smaller. So on-street parking. Let's take a good look at on-street parking. And we saw examples of that in Australia during COVID with the concept of the parklet, but let's make that a permanent change as well. We're also seeing some really good evolution around microgrids and how we generate our electricity, sustainable waste management, and also sustainable urban design for water, how we consume and how we recover water as well. So there's some of the good stuff that we've seen. I think we need corporations to get on board from an environmental social governance perspective as well.
The bottom line, if the world hopes to limit global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees by reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050, cities will have to play a central role. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Sustainability Leaders series. I'm Oriel Morrison. For more in this special 12-part series, head to apacnetwork.com.